Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you this evening. Now, on Sunday, thousands of people turned up for the Kongres Maruah Melayu, or the Malay Dignity Congress, at Stadium Malawati, insyaAllah. And to discuss this further, we have on the line with us Ahmad, Fuad, Rahmat, founder of Project Dialogue and teacher with the School of Media, Languages and Culture at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Fuad, thanks so much for joining us this evening. Now, my first question to you is the name of the Congress itself. Why do you think it was termed a Dignity Congress? I mean, how exactly is Malay dignity under threat?
Well, I think it's trying to capitalize in a general sense that Malays are left behind by the dominant political agenda. It's trying to foster some sense of, collective solidarity in light of that. So it recognizes that Malays are not necessarily, or Malay issues are not necessarily at the forefront of the reform government, which is, more interested in changing the political culture, changing the laws, so on and so forth. So I think it was trying to ride on that.
Do you think the loss of UMNO, so long a symbol of the Malay agenda, is partly to, the reason why there is so much talk about the Malay agenda, even though, for all intents and purposes, nothing has changed in terms of Malay dominance, not demographic, not politically, and so on and so forth?
Well, that might be how it comes across to maybe the urban liberal radar, but if you just sort of, have a sense of their concerns, which is not necessarily widely represented in the media, you know that there's a change in temperature, right? So there are a couple of, I think, red flags that trigger Malay sort of sentiment, namely one, the scaling down of funding for PPRs. That one has become a racialized issue. I think people see that as affecting a huge Malay populace. The lack of priority towards felder issues, I think, is another kind of gap in the current discourse. And of course, the fact that the government isn't necessarily putting Malay issues front and center. So there's a jarring transition that I think a lot of the Malay voter base isn't quite adapting to. And this Congress is trying to tap into that.
Right. Fuad, this is not the first time within the space of weeks that we've had these types of events and this type of rhetoric. Just a few weekends ago, we had the UMNO Pass Charter at the Perhimpunan Penyatuan Ummah. Now, you talked about a change in the temperature, Fuad. Just to what extent do you think that the anger is organic, that it's coming from grassroots rather than it being manufactured?
I think it's a coming together of two elements here. The first is political opportunism by the mainstream Malay parties seeking a base of sorts. But you can tell too that certain issues have triggered insecurities. I mean, just think of how the Adib inquest was dealt with, and the different ways in which that too was racialized, and that is linked to a longer sort of unresolved issue regards to the Seafield Temple. So I think it doesn't help, too, that we're in an age of social media where insecurities are much easily amplified. So it's a coming together of different aspects that make it, a perfect storm of sorts for that sort of politics, The economy isn't improving as well. So go on,
Fuad, if I could jump into this discussion, there was, of course, the way in which it was constructed. This was not essentially seen as something put together by political parties. It seemed, it was headed by a former academic. A lot of, in fact, institutions, educational institutions were involved. And Dr. Mahathir was kind of invited into this conversation. Is that a lot of wayang, or is that, in fact, how you think this is? This was a genuine kind of ground-up kind of conversation?
But I don't know if that's the best way to approach it. I mean, who's to say exactly what's genuine? I think the safe bet is to say that there is a need to put Malay issues at the forefront of national discourse again. And this conference did that. it basically put Malay issues on the map again. Even though it was haphazard, people got food poisoning, and there's sort of this double speak. On one hand, people insist that it's not racist because, there's no real, firebrand rhetoric. But on the other hand, you had Zainal Kling's keynote speech, which is, quoting the Quran and stressing how Malaysia is only for Malays, and so I don't think that's necessarily, the actual content of it is not necessarily the point, nor is it about clear messaging, but the fact that Malays can be galvanized, and they want to have their grievances felt, even though it's not necessarily articulated very clearly. But we're in the game of moral sentiment here.
Fuad, would you consider this a success then? Would you consider the Congress a success for its objectives?
Yeah, in a very crude sense. Insofar as Malaysia still hasn't really overcome the Malay issue, right? That, even though we have a new government, racial thinking is still something we have to grapple with. In that very minimal way, and the fact that we're kind of concerned about it enough to talk about it, it's already met its objectives. Now, I don't think after this people can say that, we can kind of pretend and kind of deploy a colorblind politics or something. Something has to be said of this. And I think insofar as they're getting a reaction, then they've met an objective, a significant one.
Right. Fuad, as you said, Professor Zainal Kling kind of set the tone with his speech that, the social contract, if it was not adhered to, he says he defined it, could be broken. And he, as you said that, Malaysia is essentially one that is owned by Malays alone. It doesn't seem like Dr. Mahathir followed on that narrative. He didn't build on it. And in fact, he seemed to go off on a completely different tangent, upsetting many groups, including the cleric Abdul Maza and, journalists like Rocky Brew and all that, who've all weighed in saying, they were very unhappy with him. What happened, do you think?
I think he realizes that that's not the crowd that he needs to appease at this point. I think there's a sense in which he obviously is, for most of his career, a Malay nationalist icon. He can't just leave that behind. But he's also got a different political vehicle now. And I think he has enough of a majority to know that he does not have to pander to that sentiment. So I think he used the platform to sort of repeat familiar Mahathir truisms, about how Malays need to buck up and all that, which isn't refreshing. But I think in that sense, he gets to speak to both crowds, right? He criticized Malays enough to show that he's still concerned. But on the other hand, he doesn't really go where they want him to go. So that to me is how I read the maneuvering.
All right, Fuad, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. Now we'll be back with more on Consider This in just a couple of minutes, so stay tuned.